I'd like to welcome everyone. This is the final lecture of this year's Africa in the Medieval World lecture series, which began, whoa, there we go, there's the sound, yikes, which began back in September? Yes, September of 2018, with a talk that focused on, or sort of had as its launching point, the history of medieval Ethiopia. And so I'd like to say we planned it this way, but it kind of happened this way, that we're kind of coming back full circle to return to Ethiopia again and think about Ethiopia and its global connections. This has been a really exciting series, and we're looking forward to continuing the collaboration that it represents between the African studies community and the medieval studies community here at Harvard, and hopefully build upon that in coming years. I'd like to thank, this is a chance which I haven't had up to now, to thank our collaborators in this series, in particular the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, and the Center for African Studies and the Department of African and African American Studies here at Harvard, who've all been very generous with their time and with their energy, and I guess most importantly with their money, to make this possible. And as I said, we're hoping that this will continue in years to come. I think that's about it. I would like to take the opportunity now to introduce my colleague Kay Chalamet, who will introduce tonight's speaker. And again, this wonderful moment of returning to origins. Kay introduced our opening speaker, and she'll be introducing our final one tonight. So, Kay.
It is such a pleasure to introduce Professor Samantha Kelly to you today. And Professor Kelly, I want to tell you the backstory and then get into the current time. But she was trained as a historian of medieval Europe who specialized in Italian politics and culture. And having received her undergrad degree from Yale and her PhD from Northwestern in 1998. Since 1999, she's been a member of the history faculty at Rutgers, where she holds the rank of full professor today. Her 2003 prize-winning book, The New Solomon, Robert von Jeux, and 14th Century Kinship, explored the strategies of a monarch who ruled several Mediterranean territories and who cultivated an image of erudition and piety that attracted the attention of notables such as Petrarch and Dante. In 2011, Professor Kelly published another book, an introduction to and critical edition of the first vernacular history of Naples. And there she explored a text integral to Neapolitan community identity and the basis of many later histories of that city and kingdom. And now into the current. In 2012 and 2013, Samantha Kelly expanded her horizons. She received a Mellon New Directions Fellowship to begin the study of Ge'ez, the ancient Semitic language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the literary language in which medieval Ethiopian royal chronicles and other literature was written. Her goal was to study Ethiopian and European relations from a dual perspective. And she now has a number of projects well underway, and they include editing The Companion to Medieval Ethiopia, a collection of essays by 20 scholars. Secondly, a database of manuscripts and printed books that once belonged to the Ethiopian pilgrim hostel in Rome, Santo Stefano. And thirdly, she has a monograph underway, Crucible of Christian Cultures, focused on Ethiopian and European intellectual collaboration in the Age of Reformation. And this last volume was one for which she received an ACLS fellowship in 2017. Professor Kelly has a number of articles recently published and in press, and I would mention in particular her very lively contribution on Eustathians at the Council of Florence in 1441. This is actually a very exciting article that sheds new light on the identity of the Ethiopian monastic representatives at the Council of Florence and their diplomatic impact on relations between Ethiopia, Europe, Jerusalem, and Cairo. In addition to the Mellon Foundation grant and the ACLS grant, which I mentioned, Professor Kelly has received fellowships from the American Academy in Rome, the Istituto Italiano di Studi Storici in Naples, and the École Française in Rome, and Villa I Tatti. So today we will get a glimpse of Samantha Kelly's growing contributions to our understanding of Africa in the medieval world through her paper, Connected Histories, Ethiopia and the Global Middle Ages. Please join me in welcoming Professor Samantha Kelly to Harvard.
Thank you, Kay, for that very nice introduction. I'd like also to thank the Committee on Medieval Studies, the Department of African and African American Studies, and the Hutchins Center for inviting me to speak to you today. And thanks to Sean Gilstor for arranging my visit. We had a few hiccups, but in the end, everything worked out well. And thank you all for coming on this rainy and cold day. One of the goals of this lecture series is to interrogate the value and applicability of the Middle Ages as a periodization for Africa. As someone who works on connections between Africa and Western Europe, the birthplace of this periodization, I'm certainly inclined to see a value in it. A template that places Africa and Europe in the same epochal category helps to see those regions as coeval and potentially in conversation, and thus promises to foster more attention to their connections, much as the rise of the early modern Atlantic world and the medieval Mediterranean has helped foster research into connections in those zones. It's true that the medieval Mediterranean already includes parts of Africa, and so does the early modern Atlantic world, whose early stages of formation may arguably be placed in the medieval period. So I think the question really concerns the applicability of the medieval periodization for Africa generally. But it's precisely the generalizing function of the medieval as a periodization that is the rub. As you all know, I'm sure, a central post-colonial critique of imposing a Western European periodization on other world regions is that it creates asynchrony, allowing a non-European society to be characterized as still medieval, while Europe in the same era is already modern. This is because in its origins, this periodization posited the medieval as the opposite of the modern, the feudal to its capitalist, the religious to its secular, and placed the medieval simultaneously in the European past and the non-European elsewhere. Asynchrony, therefore, is not a flaw created by global history as an approach, but an inheritance that, in fact, global historians aim to undo. And one solution that has been preferred is to make the medieval a neutral category, such that whatever occurred within its chronological window would count as medieval, free of a priori characterizations like feudal, religious, or whatever they may be. I wholly endorse an effort to see beyond narrow regional boundaries in a less tendentious and hierarchized way, but to approach the medieval as a neutral time window still runs up against two problems. First, what time window? The dates most often cited in global medieval projects are 500 to 1500, and those are quite clearly predicated on Europe. This is not necessarily a problem if the time window works for other cultures, as Alan Strathern has recently discussed with regard especially to Asia in the early modern period. The question is thus whether the so-called medieval millennium does make sense in terms of the internal dynamics of the multiple African and non-African societies, whether it truncates, bisects, and generally makes nonsense of those meaningful arcs of each society or not. The mention of internal dynamics points to a related issue. The dates we choose to delineate epochs for Western Europe or for any region are never wholly neutral. They are always predicated on what we see as meaningful turning points. If 500 to 1500 is held on as a window for Western Europe, it's because, to some extent, Europeanists still see something significant about the disappearance of Roman administrative structures and the political hegemony of Germanic peoples, on the one hand, and the several events that might roughly be grouped around 1500 on the other. The beginnings of colonization in the Americas, the schism in the Western Church, the advent of print. Even those who advocate dispensing with the Middle Ages as a period altogether and replacing it with a great intensification and a great diversification base that new division of time on what they see as meaningful internal turning points, in that case usually relative to Eurasia. So a typological sense of what a period signifies is very hard to get away from. Nonetheless, and this is a third critique, as soon as we set dates, and therefore implicitly decide upon what features make an era differ from neighboring eras, and presumably therefore cohere in some way within itself, we have set up certain features as characteristic, whether they are feudal bonds or segmented trade networks or intensified urbanism or a particular relationship of clerical elites to the state. And that means we are less likely to pay attention to those features that don't fit the norm. I should like to observe that all these flaws of the medieval are apparent in the application of this periodization to Western Europe itself, as Western Europeanists are well aware. There, too, peoples and practices that don't conform to a conceived norm have tended to be overlooked. Those who are nomadic rather than settled, who are pagan rather than Christian, for instance. There, too, the dates 500 to 1500 can't account for regional variation, and variation by type of phenomenon. This is why 15th century Italy can be described as already modern, while contemporary England was still medieval. Why agriculture, which persisted with little change from the 11th to the 18th century, doesn't fit a medieval periodization at all. If we understand this periodization as imposed upon the European past, as well as upon the non-European elsewhere, and with many of the same problems, I think we might already, to cite another of this series' goals, find a common ground between European medievalists and Africanists working in the same period. Furthermore, it seems to me that these flaws, rather than inhibiting our practice, can be, and often are, a stimulus to our practice. We recognize that the delineation of a big historical time period is a very blunt tool, and we set about, in our research and in our teaching, pointing out the regional variations it glosses over, the different chronologies in the political or cultural sphere, the occluded groups. We point out the eruptions of the modern in the heart of the medieval period, that is, the instances in which a medieval-modern opposition makes no sense. And we propose alternate time categories that overlap or compete with the medieval, like late antiquity or old regime Europe. I think this is precisely how the best approaches to the global Middle Ages are proceeding as well, with awareness of all the flaws of the basic general category, but nonetheless a willingness to posit a ground upon which its problems are pointedly addressed, and upon which its virtues, because it does have virtues, can be exploited. I am not sure if we will ever find a single medieval frame, chronologically or typologically, that aligns with the historical dynamics of the many individual African and non-African societies. But what we can do is think critically about the time windows we apply to our regions of specialty and the priorities they imply, and think simultaneously between and across regions to see what emerges. One potentially fruitful way to do that is to think about multiple and overlapping frames, a sort of mosaic in which each frame can attend to the chronological and regional specificity of its subject, but their relations to each other as pieces of a larger picture are also kept in mind. So I'd like to present a few such frames related to Ethiopia. Let me start just with the frame of Ethiopia itself. And I use the term Ethiopia here as a shorthand for what is often called the historical Ethiopian area, which includes much but not all of the current states of Ethiopia and Eritrea. It's one laboratory for thinking about how the Middle Ages might apply to Africa, and indeed I've had occasion over the last year to reflect on what it might constitute for Ethiopia, temporally, demographically, and geographically, because I've been editing, as Kay mentioned, a collection of essays intended to survey the state of the field in Ethiopian studies in this period, for which we've had no synthetic treatment since 1972. Historically, and still today, the bulk of research on Ethiopia in and before the 16th century concerns its Christian kingdom. So this sort of just shows you the topography in some of the major regions, but this one might be easier to read. There are a number of reasons for this concentration on the Christian kingdom. From the vastly larger corpus of written source material for the Christian kingdom, to the long political dominance of the Christian power in Ethiopia, to the almost equally long European tradition of identifying Ethiopia primarily or exclusively with its Christian state. In recent decades, however, there has been a good deal of work, especially archaeological, on medieval Islamic Ethiopia, and a smaller but growing body of work on those medieval societies that adhered to no revealed religion, and which in the volume we refer to as local religious societies. A central goal of the volume was to include all of these peoples, as well as the Beta Israel, or Ethiopian Jews, in the definition of Ethiopia, and to approach the non-Christian societies from the vantage of their own source materials as much as possible. So not only through what the Christian sources had to say about them. For me, this relates to a comment Daphne Gallagher made here in the fall about including in our purview those West African societies that were not involved in trans-Saharan trade. There are certain biases built into what has traditionally been perceived as most important about a particular region. In West Africa, perhaps it is trans-Saharan trade. In Ethiopia, the Christian kingdom. But research has already moved beyond that, and we need to make that visible. So that answered the question of who. The next question was, when? What time period forms a meaningful unit in Ethiopia? Well, for the Christian kingdom, the 7th century works well as a starting point, being the century that saw the decline of the ancient Aksumite kingdom. It also makes some sense for Islamic Ethiopia, since tradition dates the earliest presence of Muslims in the country to the first Hijra of 615 AD. Its relevance for local religious Ethiopians, however, is probably minimal, nor do we have sufficient data to suggest what alternate chronology might be meaningful that isn't related to contact with Christianity and Islam. Furthermore, even for Christian Ethiopians, the 7th century works well politically, but not culturally. In cultural terms, one has to go back to the 4th century and the conversion to Christianity and the whole cultural package that laid the foundations for Christian culture there ever afterward. This is essentially the late antique conundrum, and is why I couldn't fall back on defining the era simply in terms of terminal dates. On the back end of the time window, 1527 has become a relatively standard end date for the Christian kingdom, just before the great Muslim jihad that devastated it politically and materially. But that date made little sense for the other societies. Looking at them all together, the mid-16th century emerged as a more compelling watershed, both for internal reasons, notably the migration of the Oromo into formerly Christian and Islamic lands, which transformed the historical Ethiopian area from then on, and for reasons that reflected more global phenomena, the establishment of a relatively lasting Western European and Ottoman presence in Ethiopian territory, which was itself a reflex, in part, of the Portuguese-Ottoman rivalry for dominance in Indian Ocean trade. The mid-16th century has its flaws as an end date too, of course. For one, it makes no sense at all for some phenomena. Manuscript production, for instance, which fits pretty neatly into a medieval periodization in Western Europe, does not in Ethiopia, where it continued with notable stability for centuries afterwards, and was supplemented, but not supplanted, by print only in the 20th century. Finally, there was the question of whether to call this period from the 4th or 7th century to the mid-16th medieval. There are specifically Ethiopian chronological terms one can use. They are post-Aksumite, Zagwe era, Solomonic. None of them applies to this period as a whole, but more importantly, all refer specifically to the Christian kingdom. To impose them upon the histories of Muslim Ethiopians or local religious Ethiopians would involve its own hierarchies and occlusions, ones that remain politically sensitive in Ethiopia today. The term medieval in this context is arguably less loaded than the locally generated alternatives, and it is the one I ultimately decided to use. So the volume is called Companion to Medieval Ethiopia and Eritrea, and it will be out in January 2020. Is that entirely satisfying? No. For one, history is not the dominant discipline in Ethiopian studies, and many other prominent disciplines like philology, archaeology, liturgical studies don't define themselves by chronological era and don't place a great deal of weight on such divisions. That means that probably few Ethiopianists think of themselves as medievalists, including many of the contributors to this volume. Secondly, and doubtless related to that last observation, while medieval history is taught in Ethiopian universities and is called medieval, its end date can vary depending on the professor, from the 16th century jihad to the Gondarine era in the 17th century to the Zamana Matsafent, or Age of the Princes, in the 18th. Stepping back, one final observation I'd like to make is that even at this quite restricted geographical level, there is not one homogeneous Ethiopia to treat, any more than there is one homogeneous West Africa or Western Europe. And some of the challenges of articulating and naming a coherent chronological period have to do with this diversity. Nonetheless, we might say that Christian, Muslim, and local religious Ethiopians, the latter, of course, not being one group but several, form a tightly enough integrated unit that we would perhaps call this a history and not a connected history. We think of connected history as being between two or more clearly distinct cultures, but this is evidently a matter of degree and of perspective. If we look to Ethiopia's regional implications, we are more firmly in the ground of connected history, and this is a second frame that I'd like to present for consideration. For Christian Ethiopia, the connections orient principally northward toward fellow Christian communities, Egypt above all, as I'm sure you know, but also Nubia, Palestine, the Eastern Mediterranean more generally. Its kings also had diplomatic relations with Islamic Yemen, and of course with the Muslim rulers of Egypt. Islamic Ethiopia, not surprisingly, had its closest ties to other societies of the Dar al-Islam: Yemen, the Hijaz, Egypt, also more distant locations like Damascus and Baghdad. The connections of the Christian kings, the Muslim sultans, or local religious rulers in the south and west with their own further neighbors are more difficult to trace, although some current work, notably by Alfredo González Rubial, is exploring it. But certainly in terms of trade, it is clear that the local religious societies neighboring Christian and Islamic states acquired goods and enslaved people from their own further neighbors, and then sold them either to Christians, mostly for internal use, or to Muslims, who were the primary vector of their exportation abroad. One thing that you'll notice about this frame is that there's no handy name for it. It's not a Mediterranean world, or a Red Sea world, or an Indian Ocean world, although it traverses all three. It's not only the Horn of Africa, or even Northeast Africa, but includes also Southwest Asia. I suspect that it makes it harder for us to see it as a unit of analysis. But scholars are placing it in their sights. And one current effort in this direction is a European Research Council project under the direction of the Mamluk scholar Julien Loiseau, called Horn East. And I take this from its homepage. Its aim, and I quote here, is to document the relations between the Christian societies of the Horn of Africa and their Islamic environment, including Egypt, Palestine, and the Arabian Peninsula during the medieval millennium. So in this context, we could discuss debates over the term medieval in Islamic studies, much critiqued by Daniel Verisco in 2007. But I note that a recent discussion by Konrad Hirschler and Sarah Bowen-Savant treats it as widely accepted in Islamic studies, not as a default European import, but due to the acceptance of late antiquity as a meaningful period that served here as the crucible for Islam. In any case, you'll note that here, as usual in Islamic studies, the medieval period starts in the 7th century and it ends in the 15th, the break doubtless being the advent of Ottoman rule in Egypt and Palestine. The connections within this frame were variously institutional, diplomatic, commercial, religious, artistic, literary, technological. They were deep, in other words, and they were durable. And this is what makes it a particularly important frame. If I wanted to attach dates to it, certainly the connections of the northern Ethiopian region, eastward and northward, go way back. But in terms of the larger Ethiopian area depicted here, so right, this area is connected for centuries and millennia. But if we want to consider the whole Ethiopian area considered here, it's post-antique, so medieval, if you will. If we wished to tease out specific connections from this matrix, however, the geographical frame could be extended. My essay for the collected volume, for instance, concerns medieval Ethiopian diasporas. For Christian Ethiopians, as I discussed here in my talk in 2017, the diasporic settlements were oldest and most concentrated in the Eastern Mediterranean, but ultimately extended to the West, and specifically to Rome. In keeping with the more inclusive vision of Ethiopians employed in the volume, I decided to put this Christian diaspora in conversation with the diaspora of free Muslim Ethiopians who formed similar communities in Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Baghdad between the 13th and the 15th centuries, which are here in blue, and with the diaspora of enslaved Ethiopians, who were primarily local religious. The latter were, of course, different in that their migration was involuntary, and they were rarely able to form communities abroad, but in some cases they did. An early example is the Ethiopian slave dynasty that ruled in coastal Yemen in the 11th and early 12th century, so that's the Najahids you see there. But more numerous are the examples in India, where the enslaved formed distinctive Habshi military regiments numbering in the thousands in Gujarat and elsewhere, acted as an important political bloc in the Bahmani Sultanate in the 15th century, and in fact took de facto control of two of its successor states just after our period. So that's Ahmednagar and Bijapur that you see there, and created a brief formal Habshi state in Bengal in the 1490s. Discussing these three diasporas together, of course, points up their differences, but also their overlaps and convergences. Christian Ethiopians were also enslaved and sold abroad, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries, and thus shared the experience of local religious. This also meant that in places like Cairo and Jerusalem, there were both free Christian Ethiopian communities and enslaved Christian Ethiopians put up for sale in the markets. As for local religious, when enslaved by Muslims for export, they were invariably converted to Islam and might find themselves in the same cities as free Ethiopian Muslims. And there, they might indeed identify with that free Muslim Ethiopian community, despite their origins in a different region, language, and culture. The parameters of this aggregate diaspora correspond more or less to those of the trade networks in which Ethiopia was involved, and not by accident. But foregrounding the diaspora emphasizes the outward movement of Ethiopian people and the ways they impacted their host societies, military and politically, particularly to the east, or culturally and intellectually, particularly to the north and west. My current book project focuses on one corner of this diasporic settlement, the Christian Ethiopian community in Rome, established at the church-turned-Ethiopian monastery of Santo Stefano no later than 1497, and the intellectual projects that its members undertook in collaboration with European scholars and with the backing of high-ranking Catholic prelates in the first half of the 16th century. You might notice that this time window does not correspond to most European definitions of the medieval, but it does correspond nicely to what I see as an Ethiopian frame of the medieval, and I think it's also valid in Western Europe in terms of the religious intellectual history that I'm centrally concerned with in this project. The meaningful frame here, as I proposed already in my earlier talk of 2017, is the Christian ecumene. This, I suggest, is the conceptual context that made Christian Ethiopians and Catholic Europeans visible and significant to each other in the first place. Specifically, it was the ancient Christian ecumene. It was the antiquity of Rome, its possession of the relics of apostolic saints, that made it an attractive pilgrimage destination for Ethiopian Christians. It was the apostolic foundation of the Roman See that allowed the Christian Ethiopian king to flirt with the possibility of placing the Ethiopian church under the Pope's patriarchal authority, rather than that of Alexandria. And it was the antiquity of the Ethiopian church that induced some Catholics to consider it a living vestige of the early church, whose witness could potentially be used as a weapon against the Protestants to prove the antiquity and truth of Catholicism's own positions. The ancient Christian ecumene is a concept, and there are various ways that you could visualize it geographically. So here I've just noted the 5 patriarchal sees and shaded more or less the boundaries of the early 5th century, so including Armenia and Aksum, but I've also shaded in a different color the communities that were Christianized from the 6th century, but that were understood to have apostolic foundations. So Nubia and the so-called St. Thomas Christians of India. We could have an interesting discussion about when this time frame is activated as an influential construct, but in the particular form that I'm engaged with, it's short, early 15th to mid-16th century. The frame of the ancient Christian ecumene doesn't just outline what was at stake in the Catholic Ethiopian encounter, it also brings into view the other communities of the ancient ecumene and the ways they figured in the Catholic Ethiopian collaborations and what that figuring might imply. The principal patron, and apparently the mastermind of the collaboration at Santo Stefano, was Cardinal Marcello Cervini, a humanist and a reformer who was also one of the heads of the Council of Trent. and the way he kept tabs from Trent on the Ethiopians' progress and received the texts they translated into Latin for him, so you see him here at the top of this, Marcello Cervini, was through his man on the ground in Rome, Guglielmo Sirleto. But Sirleto was also, and primarily, supplying Cervini with data from ancient Greek Christian texts, searching out manuscripts and copying out the relevant passages to send on to Trent. This is not surprising if we think in terms of humanism. Inquiring into ancient Greek texts is what we most associate with the Renaissance. But the pairing here means that we should also be thinking about Gez in terms of humanistic inquiry into the classical past. And conversely, that we should be thinking about the Greeks, not only in terms of antiquity, but in terms of the contemporary community of Greek Orthodox and how Catholic authorities were approaching them alongside the Ethiopians, whether they were schismatic or essentially Catholic, whether in need of conversion or able legitimately to practice their own rites. And then there's Syriac and the ancient Syrian church. Already in the 1510s, which is precisely when the very first Ge'ez religious text was printed in Rome, 1513, Pope Leo X summoned a group of Syriac speakers to check and correct his New Testament against their own. Now, those Syriac speakers were Maronites and therefore Catholics. But in 1549, a Syrian Orthodox Christian named Moses of Mardin arrived in Rome from his home in Mesopotamia, hoping to print Bibles in Syriac. He was first lodged with the Ethiopians at Santo Stefano, presumably because they were all non-Chalcedonian Christians, but also because the Ethiopians had just printed a New Testament in their own language and script and therefore could serve as a model for his project. And a few years later, Moses received financial support for his Bible project from the Ethiopians' own patron, Marcello Cervini. And in fact, the Syriac Bible was printed a few years later in 1555. This is not to say that all anciently founded Christian communities excited equal interest with regard to their ancient heritage, nor that they were all treated in the same manner in contemporary Catholic policy, but it does suggest that Ethiopian Orthodox, who certainly viewed themselves as full members of a universal Christian community and as authoritative scholars on the Christian tradition, were also viewed as such by some of the highest-ranking Catholic authorities, and, significantly, in a framework of the ancient ecumene, in which Greek or Mesopotamian or European or Asian or African, I would also say white or olive or black, were not particularly relevant distinctions. The ancient Christian ecumene certainly had a special significance for Catholic scholars and for the Ethiopian Orthodox themselves. At the same time that the Ethiopians of Santo Stefano and Catholic scholars were collaborating, however, the contemporary Christian ecumene was, of course, expanding. And here there is a much larger frame that deserves consideration, related to Catholic missionary activity and the colonization of territory that in some cases went with it. And here, with regard specifically to Africa, it seems to me that there's an interesting comparative and connected history to explore with regard to Christian Ethiopia and Christian Congo. As in Ethiopia, religious decisions in Congo, notably the decision to adopt Roman Catholicism in the late 15th century, was in the hands of the local ruler. As in Ethiopia, it was local elites who established and oversaw the faith, in this case, receiving instruction in Portugal, but then returning to instruct their fellow Congolese. Importantly, the Congolese king's own son, Enrique, was ordained bishop in Portugal in 1518 and returned to Congo in the hope of ordaining priests and creating a self-sustaining Congolese church personnel. As that example indicates, for the first 50 years or so of Congolese Christianity, European authorities, Portuguese and papal, as well as missionaries on the ground in Congo, were deferential to these local authorities and were also rather tolerant of Congolese Christianity's deviations from European Catholic norms. Again, this was also true of Catholic relations with Ethiopia in this period. John Thornton pointed out these features of Congo in an article of 2013, where he also observed the beginnings of a shift in policy in the 1530s. In 1534, under Portuguese pressure, the Pope transferred authority over the Congolese church to the See of São Tomé and its Portuguese bishop. So São Tomé, of course, is up here, well outside of Congo. And thereafter, relations between this Portuguese bishop and Congo were increasingly hostile. So it strikes me that in the same decade, an Ethiopian Christian ambassador to Western Europe named Sagat Zaab was detained in Portugal for years and accused of heresy. This was the first time that an Ethiopian Orthodox in Europe was subjected to such treatment. And one of his interrogators, as Sagat Zaab himself reported, was none other than the Bishop of San Tomé, Diogo Ortiz de Villegas. So you can see here, he speaks of the disputes and arguments that he had with the Bishop of San Tomé, in which he is chastised in a harsh and hostile way, that he and all his people have been subject to slanders and reproaches, called Jews and Muslims. He was forbidden from receiving communion for 7 years, and I am reputed among Christian brethren as a pagan and one accursed, ethnicus et anathema. It would take another decade and more for this more intolerant attitude toward Ethiopian Orthodox to penetrate the papal curia in a significant way. Tesfatsion, the lead Ethiopian scholar in Rome, complained of his community being suspected of heresy in 1548. And after the death of their papal patron, Pope Paul III, in 1549, and then of Tesfatsion himself in 1552, their fortunes do seem to have declined in Rome. By 1556, a Jesuit mission was sent to Ethiopia too, with the aim of converting its heretics. But despite the small time lag, there is, I think, a suggestive convergence here with Portugal as its node. If we look at the course of Catholic relations with Congo and Ethiopia together, we may be seeing a shift in which the distinctions between an ancient church like Ethiopia and a recently established one like Congo, or indeed between Christian populations like both Ethiopia and Congo and heathen ones, became less significant in the context of a global missionizing effort in which only European Catholicism could be valid. Portuguese activity in West Africa impacted the Ethiopians' experience in Europe in another way as well, in importing increasing numbers of enslaved black Africans to southern Europe from the mid-15th century on, such that the vast majority of people who resembled the Ethiopians physiognomically were either enslaved or formerly enslaved. This was true in Rome, in Venice, the port through which most passed in arriving in Europe, and in Iberia, where a number of Ethiopians traveled, either on pilgrimage to Compostela or for other reasons. The Catholic prelates and scholars who interacted with and wrote about the Ethiopian monks of Santo Stefano have nothing to say about this. That is, they virtually never describe the monks of Santo Stefano as black or as African. Paolo Giovio, who held conversations with Tesfatsion and with ambassadors from Ethiopia, described the Ethiopian king as the color of a roasted pheasant. This is the portrait done in Europe based on descriptions of Ethiopians and ambassadors who had been there that Paolo Giovio himself collected. Nor do they allude to potential public confusion of Ethiopians with slaves, runaway slaves, or former slaves in southern Europe. Nor do the Ethiopian monks themselves make such comments. Tesfatsion complains of being suspected of heresy, but not of being denigrated as black. Yet I think there is a conceptual frame that ought to be articulated here, even out of silence, the frame of race. Perhaps it is significant that the papal court continued to use the outmoded 15th century term Indian to refer to Ethiopian Christians. Perhaps it was to distinguish them from those termed Africans, who seem to have been defined as non-Christian in origin, and therefore in Europe were virtually always the enslaved. The papal treasury documents for Pope Paul IV mention 2 of each, that is, 2 Indians and 2 Africans, clearly distinguished, to be dressed in fine clothes for his coronation in 1555. So these are from the documents of the company that provided these clothes for the papal court, that of Bartolomeo Buzzotti. And as you can see, first he names these 2 Africani battezzati by His Holiness, right? So they're Africans who have to be baptized, which means they came as non-Christians, but also Giovanni Battista Indiano, so he is one of the Ethiopians from Santo Stefano, and then just another European. And then we see them paired here Giovanni Battista Indiano, and another, Fra Giorgio, who's also from Santo Stefano, and then the same two Africans battezzati by the Pope. Perhaps Indian was a useful alternative not only to African, but even to the term Ethiopian. Even though Ethiopian was by now the more usual European term for Christians from the Horn of Africa used in Europe, and the term that Christian Ethiopians generally preferred for themselves, it too was open to ambiguity, being in Europe a generic term for all sub-Saharan Africans, and, according to Kate Lowe, was the word used in Venice specifically to denote household slaves, Ethiopi. The distinction drawn in such terminological choices would be, of course, that the Indians, unlike other Black Africans, were anciently Christian and free. That's worth noting, because it suggests that skin color was not, yet, the sole and determining factor in classification of peoples, and that other criteria, like religion and status, could be judged more salient. At the same time, we can observe that it was perhaps necessary to make such terminological choices and to observe silences about the Ethiopians' geographical origin or color, a silence that was not observed in earlier sources or in more hostile contemporary ones, precisely because the growing presence of enslaved Black Africans in Europe was blurring those boundaries. And indeed, there is at least one clue that the blurred boundary was not only potential but actual. In the set of regulations drawn up by the Ethiopians for their own community of Santo Stefano in 1551, there is a clause stipulating that Ethiopians who had been enslaved by Muslims and had escaped and been released could be housed at the monastery, even though they had not come for pious purposes. So I've given the guess of a few notable terms. Interestingly, they don't use the usual terms for slaves in Ethiopia, which are gabur, baria, or abd, but rather terms for captive, so the toa or dewo in the second one. It's also hard to tell from the verbs amsatu and dernu who the agent of their liberation was. One possibility is that the enslaved did actually escape. Another is that they were redeemed by co-religionists from slave markets, perhaps in Italy itself, although neither the rule of Santo Stefano nor any of the bequests that I have found in Ethiopian manuscripts in Rome ever speak of an activity of redemption. Or more probably from the markets of Cairo or Jerusalem, where we do have some evidence of Christian Ethiopians enslaved and sold, and where there were also free Ethiopian Christians who could redeem them. Whatever the case, it is clear that some Ethiopian Christians in Rome too had experienced slavery, and that distinctions of legal status did not wholly separate them from other Black Africans in Europe. I make these observations not to minimize the anti-racist potential of Christian universalism, for this was the frame in which Ethiopian Christians could and did advocate for their past heritage and contemporary culture and influence powerful European decision makers. My point is rather that the frame of the Christian ecumene could be deployed in different ways, not all benign, and that its competition and negotiation with other conceptual frames is part of this story too. I see them intersect, for instance, in the 17th century Catholic promotion of Saint Elesban, actually the 6th century Ethiopian Orthodox king and Saint Ella Etzbaha, transformed now into a Catholic to appeal through his Blackness to enslaved Africans and their descendants. I have focused on frames today because they apply to two subjects I wanted to treat: a reflection on the medieval as applied to Africa, and thus on the concept of a global Middle Ages, which is itself a framing device, and my own corner of global historical work, which is connected history. It remains true that all frames are oriented toward the macro picture. This is their value as a heuristic tool. It's also their weakness, for it tends to gloss over the finer grain of historical specificity and human agency. Even in a quite restricted setting, such as that of my book project, it's a generalization to speak of Catholic policy or an Ethiopian Orthodox viewpoint. Every actor who was involved in the collaborations that I study came to them with their individual experiences and motives and made choices that affected themselves and others in ways great and small. In my own practice as a historian, I try to balance the macro picture with the fine grain of individual lives. And if I had another 45 minutes, I would balance out the comments I've just made with an equal investigation of the texture of some of these lives. We'll tell you about one Jacob, a monk from eastern Tigray and a member of the Ethiopian monastic family known as the Ewastatians. In my talk here in 2017, I presented some of the manuscripts he copied as examples of Ethiopian curiosity about Catholic culture, and they are that. But here I would stress rather the ways in which his life in Europe was conditioned by and interpreted through his Ethiopian past and his specific identity there. I would tell you more about Tesfatsion, the head scholar and most famous Ethiopian in 16th century Rome, who had his own agenda in undertaking his intellectual projects, and whose close contact with Pope Paul III, among others, played a role in Catholic policy regarding Ethiopia. But instead, in the few minutes remaining to me, which are really very few, I just want to stretch out very briefly a portrait of two other figures, a kind of double portrait, because it suggests to me the ways in which attention to individual lives can not only enrich but question the generalizing categories like Catholic or Ethiopian that we sometimes need to use as a shorthand. The first is a man named Johannes. He was Ethiopian. His father was an Ethiopian priest from the Amhara region, and his mother, by his account, was from Egypt, but of Ethiopian descent. All I can show you here is, this is a very precise map of Venetian colonies. And this, although not at all precise, at least shows you the larger region. His parents migrated to Cyprus before his birth, so it was here, among the Ethiopian community of Nicosia, that he was born around 1510. As Cyprus was by then a Venetian colony, Johannes was therefore also a Venetian subject, and under the spiritual authority of the Coptic Egyptian bishop who oversaw the Ethiopian community on the island. His early culture was both decidedly Ethiopian and diasporic. It was probably his father, the priest, who first taught him Ge'ez, but he professed a monastic vocation at a quite young age, and it was the monks of Nicosia who taught him a deeper religious education and the excellent scribal skills that he displayed later in life. On the polyglot island, however, he may have already picked up some of the Italian and Arabic for which he was known in later years. In any case, at age 15, so around 1525, he traveled to Rome, probably with his father, who is reported to have died in Rome, and we can assume that his father died pretty soon after they got there, because Johannes began almost immediately to travel around Italy, to Portugal, to Compostela, back to Italy. This is likely where he picked up Latin and picked up or improved his Italian as well. Then in 1535, he returned to his native island of Cyprus, where he was ordained a priest by the Coptic bishop on the island, but ever restless, returned to Italy again 3 years later. By now, if not earlier, he had adopted the alias Giovanni Battista, by which he was now known in Europe. Now his language skills brought him to the attention of a series of ever more important Catholic prelates. First, Pier Paolo Vergerio, the reformist bishop of Capodistria near Venice, who gave him permission to chant the Mass in Latin. Then, so he tells us, Cardinal Contarini, one of the leaders of the Catholic Reform movement. And finally, around 1540, Cardinal Gian Pietro Carafa, about to become one of the heads of the Roman Inquisition, who welcomed Johannes into his household and made him a chaplain. Johannes contributed in important ways to the intellectual collaborations of his fellow Ethiopian monks in Rome, copying manuscripts, translating Ge'ez texts into Latin. He traveled to Venice to check on the arrival of a needed manuscript that was coming from his home island of Cyprus, which they needed to finish out the New Testament edition of 1548-1549. But then the Ethiopians' patron, Pope Paul III, died, and soon after, in 1552, Tesfatsion himself. Around this time, and certainly before 1555, Johannes became a Catholic. That is, he asked Cardinal Carafa whether his ordination by the heretical Coptic bishop, which is that's the language he uses, was valid. The issue was set before the Inquisition, who replied in the negative, and Johannes was reordained as a Catholic bishop. Whether Johannes really saw this as a conversion is an open question, but that he felt such authorization and reordination was now needed does suggest something about the changing tenor of the times. The Catholics certainly now viewed him as one of their own, and as a Catholic, his fortunes rose higher. When Carafa became pope in 1555, Johannes remained a chaplain and familiar in the papal household. He was a familiar and sometime translator for his successor, Pius IV, before being nominated as bishop to the Ethiopians of Cyprus, his home community, in late 1564. He sailed off to his homeland in 1565 and died soon after arrival. So the other life that I would put in conversation with Johannes's is that of Guglielmo Sirleto. I mentioned him earlier as the Greek expert who sent Greek texts as well as reports on the Ethiopians' projects to Cardinal Cervini in Trent. He's actually a pretty famous 16th century figure. He rose to become a cardinal, a bishop, and finally head of the Vatican Library, and worked on the revision of key Catholic texts in the Tridentine Age. Biographies have been written about him. Conferences have been dedicated to him. Unlike Johannes of Cyprus, I can show you his portrait. He would seem to fall quite clearly on the Catholic side of Catholic-Ethiopian collaborations. But in fact, he too began life as a member of a distinctive but tolerated Christian community under Catholic European rule. For he came from a family of Greek Orthodox in furthest Calabria, whose ancestors included an archimandrite and an abbot of the Greeks, that is, of the Basilian monastery of St. John Teristis in Stilo. The mastery of spoken and written Greek that so amazed his contemporaries later in life was due to the fact that Greek, or an Italianized dialect of it, was the language of his childhood. And while still a youth in Stilo, his father hired for him a tutor from Taranto, another region that retained aspects of Byzantine culture into the 16th century, to teach him literary Greek. Sirleto too, like Johannes, made his way as a quite poor young man in the cities of Naples and then Rome on the strength of his linguistic talents. First earning a living by tutoring the sons of the elite, he fell in with a circle of antiquarians and humanists and thus came to the attention of Cardinal Cervini and joined his household. It's fair to wonder when Guglielmo Sirleto and Johannes of Cyprus met in Rome in the 1540s, when each was still a relatively modest scholar in the service of a cardinal, how alike they might have seen themselves, both outsiders making their way in a Catholic hierarchy on the basis of pure talent and scholarly acumen, both bringing the religious traditions of their own heritage cultures to the attention of influential men of the ruling culture, and for us, looking back on them, complicating the distinctions between Western European and non-Western European, between Catholic and non-Catholic, between dominant and subaltern. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. We have time for some questions. God, this thing's loud. So I have a microphone. I'm going to pass it to Suzanne.
Thank you very much. This is really terrific. And I have two unrelated questions. I'm looking at the foundation date, or the early date of circa 1497 for Santo Stefano, and that's not so long after 1492 and the fall of Granada and Columbus. And I'm wondering if things, I hadn't really thought about things shaping differently vis-a-vis the African world at that time. Do you see a kind of connection around this 9 period with the reshaping of Europe and Africa? So that would be my first question. The second is, going back in time, I work in West Africa, in Nigeria and other places, and I'm deeply interested in the connections in the Coptic world, meaning the Egyptian Coptic world and this part of the world in the broader medieval period. And I'm struck as I look at this by the similarities between Egyptian Coptic forms, textiles, pavements, etc., and the middle of West Africa, Nigeria, Cameroon,